When was it time to stop being Mr. Nice Guy? My sister Kayla didn't come home Friday night. At 16, she had curfew at 11, and by midnight my phone was blowing up with texts from my mom asking if I'd heard from her. I called Kayla's cell 6 times, texted her a dozen more, got nothing back. My mom wanted to call the police, but I told her to wait, that teenagers miss curfew all the time and cops wouldn't do anything for hours anyway. I drove to her friend Becca's house first, then to the mall parking lot where kids hung out, then cruised past the movie theater and the diner on Main Street. Nothing. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I kept pushing that feeling down because the alternative was too horrible to consider. At 3 in the morning, Becca finally answered her phone and told me Kayla had gone to some party at the Riverside Hotel with older guys. She gave me the room number and said she'd tried to stop her, but Kayla wouldn't listen. The Riverside was one of those cheap extended stay places on the edge of town where truckers crashed and divorced dads took their kids on weekends. I parked under a flickering streetlight and took the stairs to the 3rd floor 2 at a time. Room 312 had light bleeding under the door and music thumping from inside. I pounded on the door hard enough to rattle the frame, shouting Kayla's name over the noise. The music cut off abruptly, and I heard male voices arguing about whether to answer. I kicked the door once and told them I'd break it down if they didn't open up in 5 seconds. The deadbolt clicked, and the door swung open to reveal a guy in his 30s wearing gym shorts and a tank top, tattoos covering both arms, eyes bloodshot and pupils dilated. Behind him, I could see 3 more men, all around the same age, all looking at me like I was interrupting something important. "Where's my sister?" I pushed past the guy in the doorway and saw Kayla sprawled on one of the beds. She was wearing the same clothes she'd left home in, but her shirt was riding up and her jeans were unbuttoned. Her eyes were closed and she wasn't moving. I crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her hard. Kayla's head lolled to the side and she mumbled something incoherent without opening her eyes. One of the men said she'd just had too much to drink and needed to sleep it off, that I should come back in the morning. I checked her pulse and found it weak and irregular, her skin cold and clammy. These weren't the symptoms of someone who'd just partied too hard. I pulled out my phone to call 911, and the man who'd answered the door stepped toward me with his hand out like he was going to take it from me. I'm 6'2" and spent 4 years playing linebacker in high school, but this guy had me by at least 40 pounds of muscle. The man introduced himself as Coach Dylan Mercer, said he coached football at Kayla's high school, and had run into her at a party earlier. He claimed she'd asked for a ride because she was feeling sick, and he'd brought her here to lie down where it was quiet. The story made no sense, because the Riverside was 20 minutes from where the party supposedly was, and coaches didn't bring teenage students to hotel rooms for any legitimate reason. I told him I was taking Kayla to the hospital, and he could explain himself to the police. Coach Mercer's expression changed from friendly to cold in an instant. He said his father was Judge Theodore Mercer, and his uncle was Police Chief Ronald Mercer, and if I made accusations I couldn't prove, they'd make sure I regretted it. He said this wasn't the first time some hysterical family member had misunderstood a situation, and those people had all learned to keep their mouths shut. I lifted Kayla off the bed, and she felt like dead weight in my arms. Her head fell back, and I could see bruising starting to form on her neck. The other 3 men watched me carry her toward the door, but none of them tried to stop me. Coach Mercer followed me into the hallway and told me to think very carefully about my next move. He said teenage girls lied about things all the time, especially when they got caught somewhere they shouldn't be. He said if I took Kayla to the hospital, the doctors would find alcohol and probably drugs in her system, which would make her look like just another wild kid who couldn't handle her substances. He said his family had connections throughout this town and making an enemy of them would be the biggest mistake of my life. I told him to go to hell and kept walking toward the stairs with my sister unconscious against my chest. The emergency room doctor took one look at Kayla and called for a crash cart. They got her on a gurney and wheeled her back while a nurse fired questions at me about what she'd taken and when. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much, and gave them Coach Mercer's name and the hotel room number. The nurse wrote it all down, but her expression suggested she'd heard similar stories before that went nowhere. My mom arrived 20 minutes later, her face gray with terror, and we sat together in the waiting room while they pumped Kayla's stomach and ran toxicology screens. 3 hours later, a doctor came out and confirmed what I already knew. Rohypnol in her system, the date rape drug, along with enough alcohol to put her blood alcohol level at twice the legal limit. The doctor said we were lucky I'd found her when I did, because another hour and her respiratory system might have shut down completely. My mom wanted to call the police immediately, but I told her to wait until we talked to Kayla. When they finally let us back to see her, Kayla was awake but groggy, an IV in her arm and monitors beeping steadily. She started crying the second she saw us, and the story came out in broken pieces. Coach Mercer had approached her at the mall 3 weeks ago and told her she had real potential to work with the cheerleading squad, even though she wasn't officially on the team. He'd given her his number and said to text him if she ever wanted private coaching. She thought it was weird but also kind of flattering that a coach at school noticed her. He'd texted her throughout the weeks, always friendly and encouraging, asking about her interests and her friends. Friday night, he'd invited her to a party where some college recruiters would be, said it could help her future if she made the right connections. She'd gone to the hotel expecting a party, but found only Coach Mercer and his 3 friends. They'd given her drinks that tasted strange, but she'd been too nervous to refuse. Everything after the first hour was fragmented memories. Hands on her body, voices laughing, someone filming with a phone. She remembered trying to push someone away and being held down. She remembered begging them to stop and being told to relax. She remembered one of them saying they needed to finish before anyone came looking for her. The gaps in her memory were probably a mercy, because what she did remember was already destroying her. My mom held Kayla while she sobbed, and I stepped into the hallway because I couldn't listen anymore without putting my fist through a wall. A hospital social worker appeared and suggested we file a police report. Said she'd seen cases like this before, and evidence collected now could be crucial later. The responding officer was a woman in her 40s named Detective Lisa Kowalski. She took Kayla's statement with patience and care, asking detailed questions without judgment. She photographed the bruises on Kayla's neck and arms, collected her clothes for evidence, and assured us she'd personally follow up with the hotel. 2 days later, Detective Kowalski called to say she'd interviewed Coach Mercer and his 3 friends. Their story was consistent across all 4 men. They claimed Kayla had come to the hotel voluntarily, had brought her own alcohol, and had never indicated she wanted to leave. They said she'd flirted with all of them and seemed enthusiastic about everything that happened. They provided text messages where Kayla had agreed to meet them, though those texts had been sent during the time frame when she was already drugged. Detective Kowalski said the hotel had no security cameras covering that particular hallway, and no other guests had reported hearing anything unusual. The case was going nowhere, and everyone knew it. Coach Mercer's father was indeed Judge Theodore Mercer, who'd sat on the bench for 20 years and was known for being tough on crime, except when it involved people he knew personally. His uncle, Police Chief Ronald Mercer, controlled every major decision in the department and had already made calls suggesting Detective Kowalski should be careful about pursuing unfounded accusations against respected community members. The district attorney's office looked at the evidence and declined to file charges, citing lack of physical proof of assault and the he-said-she-said nature of the testimony. They sent a letter explaining that without witnesses, video evidence, or clear signs of force beyond what consensual rough activity might produce, no jury would convict. The letter suggested Kayla might benefit from counseling to address her poor decision-making regarding alcohol and older men. Kayla stopped going to school. She stopped leaving her room. She stopped eating more than a few bites at meals. My mom took her to 3 different therapists before finding one Kayla would actually talk to. The therapist explained that what happened to Kayla was textbook predatory behavior and drugging, but that didn't change the reality that the legal system had failed her. She said recovery would take years and might never be complete. She said the worst part was often the lack of justice, the way perpetrators walked free while victims carried the weight alone. I watched my sister disappear into herself day by day and felt more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. Every time I drove past the high school and saw Coach Mercer's truck in the parking lot, rage built in my chest until I thought I might explode. 3 weeks after the hotel, I was at the grocery store when I saw Coach Mercer in the checkout line. He was laughing with the cashier about something, completely at ease, like he hadn't destroyed a child's life. He saw me staring and smiled, a cold, smug expression that said he'd gotten away with it, and we both knew there was nothing I could do. I abandoned my cart and left before I did something that would land me in jail. That night, I sat in my car outside the high school until after dark, watching parents pick up kids from sports practice, watching Coach Mercer walk to his truck carrying his gym bag. I followed him home and sat outside his apartment complex for an hour thinking about everything I wanted to do to him. But I was 22 years old with a clean record and a future to protect. I'd been raised to believe in the system, to trust that law and order would prevail, that faith was dying fast. My mom's older brother, my Uncle Frank, called that weekend asking how we were holding up. Uncle Frank had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and came back different. Not broken exactly, just hardened in ways that made regular civilian life difficult. He worked construction now and didn't talk much about the war except when he drank. I'd always gotten along with him because he treated me like an adult even when I was a kid. When I told him what happened to Kayla and how the case had been dropped, there was a long silence on the line. Then Uncle Frank asked if I wanted his help with the situation. His voice had a quality that made it clear what kind of help he was offering. I said I didn't know what he meant, and he said yes, I did. He said he knew people who specialized in problems the law couldn't fix. He said some men needed to learn lessons the hard way. I didn't answer right away because acknowledging what he was suggesting meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Uncle Frank said to think about it and call him if I changed my mind. He said he understood if I didn't, that not everyone could live with that kind of decision. But he also said that men like Coach Mercer only stopped when someone made them stop, and the legal system clearly wasn't going to do it. After he hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand for 20 minutes. I thought about Kayla hiding in her room. I thought about Coach Mercer smiling in that grocery store. I thought about the 2 girls Detective Kowalski had quietly mentioned, the ones who'd made similar accusations against Coach Mercer 2 years ago and 3 years ago, Both cases dropped for lack of evidence. I thought about how many more girls there would be if no one stopped him. I called Uncle Frank back at midnight and told him I wanted his help. He said to meet him at his place the next morning and not to bring my phone. I drove to his apartment complex on the industrial side of town, a building full of guys who worked with their hands and minded their own business. Uncle Frank answered the door wearing cargo pants and a black t-shirt, his hair cut military short even though he'd been out for 5 years. Inside his apartment was sparse. A couch, a TV, a weight set in the corner, not much else. He poured coffee and we sat at his kitchen table while he asked me questions about Coach Mercer, where he lived, where he worked, what his schedule looked like, who his friends were. I told him everything I'd learned from following the man for the past 3 weeks. Uncle Frank took notes on a pad of paper, his handwriting neat and precise. When I finished, Uncle Frank made a phone call. He didn't use a name, just said he needed someone with specific skills for a specific problem. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He hung up and told me it would happen in 3 days. He said I couldn't be involved directly, couldn't be anywhere near it, had to have an alibi that would hold up under scrutiny. He said what they were going to do would be violent and permanent, and there'd be no taking it back once it started. He asked if I was sure because doubt later would be dangerous for everyone involved. I thought about Kayla's face when she'd described waking up in that hotel room not knowing what had been done to her. I told Uncle Frank I was sure. He nodded and said he'd take care of everything, that I should go home and act normal and not contact him again until it was done. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went to work at the warehouse where I loaded trucks and tried to focus on anything except what was coming. I ate dinner with my mom and Kayla and made small talk about nothing. I watched TV without seeing what was on screen. I checked my phone constantly, even though Uncle Frank had told me not to expect updates. On the 3rd night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It said only, "Done," followed by a location pin for an address I didn't recognize. I deleted the text immediately and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly had been done and whether I'd be able to live with myself afterward. The local news the next morning led with a breaking story. Coach Dylan Mercer had been found in an alley behind one of the warehouses near the industrial district. He'd been severely beaten, both his hands broken in multiple places, several ribs fractured, his face swollen to the point of being unrecognizable. The reporter said police were investigating but had no suspects and no witnesses. The warehouse district was known for having minimal security camera coverage, and the specific alley where Coach Mercer was found had none at all. He was alive, but in critical condition at the county hospital. The report included a brief statement from Police Chief Ronald Mercer asking anyone with information to come forward. The chief's voice cracked when he mentioned his nephew's condition and the senseless violence that had been inflicted. I went to work like normal, forcing myself to act surprised when co-workers talked about the news. My supervisor asked if I'd heard about the coach from the high school getting attacked, and I said I had, that it was terrible, that I hoped they caught whoever did it. The lie came easier than I expected. That evening, Detective Kowalski called my mom and asked if she could speak with our family. She came to the house an hour later, looking exhausted. She said she needed to ask where I'd been 2 nights ago. My mom looked confused, but I'd been prepared for this. I told Detective Kowalski I'd been at the warehouse working a late shift, had clocked in at 6 and out at 2 in the morning. She wrote that down and said she'd verify it. Then she said something interesting. While investigating the attack on Coach Mercer, they'd executed a search warrant on his apartment and found things that changed the nature of their inquiry. Coach Mercer's apartment had contained evidence of criminal activity far beyond what we'd suspected. Multiple external hard drives filled with videos, hundreds of files showing unconscious or semi-conscious girls in various states of undress. The videos went back at least 7 years. Detective Kowalski said they'd identified 15 different victims so far, including Kayla, and expected that number to grow as they reviewed all the footage. Coach Mercer had been documenting his assaults meticulously, tagging files with dates and first names, keeping a catalog of his crimes like someone might catalog a hobby. There were also photographs, printed and stored in albums, showing girls' faces in moments of unconsciousness or distress. He'd kept articles of clothing as trophies, Ziploc bags labeled with names and dates. The scope of his predation was staggering. The discovery changed everything about the case. The district attorney's office suddenly became very interested in prosecuting. Federal charges were being considered because some of the videos appeared to show victims from other states. The FBI was involved now. Detective Kowalski said they were reaching out to all identified victims and their families, that this would be a massive investigation that could take years to fully unravel. She said the evidence was overwhelming and Coach Mercer would spend the rest of his life in prison if he survived his current injuries. She also said something strange. The timing of the attack and the subsequent search was fortunate because they might not have ever discovered the evidence otherwise. She gave me a long look when she said that, like she suspected something but couldn't prove it. I kept my face neutral and said I was glad they'd finally found proof of what he'd done. Over the following weeks, more information emerged. The 3 men who'd been with Coach Mercer at the hotel were also being investigated. All three had prior accusations that had never resulted in charges. Two of them were married with children. One worked for the city utilities department. They'd formed a group with Coach Mercer, a network of predators who shared information and sometimes shared victims. Detective Kowalski said they'd found encrypted chat logs discussing target selection, drug procurement, and techniques for avoiding legal consequences. The men had been operating for years, protected by Coach Mercer's family connections and their own careful methods. The community was reeling from the revelations. Parents were pulling kids from sports programs. The school board held emergency meetings. Judge Theodore Mercer recused himself from all related proceedings and made a public statement expressing shock and disappointment in his son. Police Chief Ronald Mercer held a press conference where he announced his retirement effective immediately. He claimed he'd had no knowledge of his nephew's activities, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to continue in his position, given the failure to investigate earlier complaints properly. The statement felt hollow given that he'd personally intervened to shut down previous investigations, but no one could prove he'd acted with knowledge of the crimes. He was retiring with full pension and benefits. The hypocrisy burned, but at least he was gone. A new police chief was appointed, a woman from outside the department who'd made her career fighting corruption. One of her first acts was to open internal investigations into how the previous complaints against Coach Mercer had been handled. 3 officers were suspended pending review. Kayla started leaving her room again. The therapist said knowing her assault had been documented and that Coach Mercer would face consequences was helping her process the trauma. It didn't erase what happened, but it removed the terrible weight of being disbelieved. 7 of the other identified victims came forward publicly, forming a support network and speaking to media about their experiences. Their bravery in sharing their stories helped others come forward. The total number of identified victims reached 23. Some had been assaulted years ago and had spent the time since believing they were alone. Now they had proof and witnesses and solidarity. Several of them filed civil suits against the school district for failing to protect students despite multiple warning signs about Coach Mercer's behavior. Coach Mercer survived his injuries but would never fully recover. His hands had been broken so severely that surgeons said he'd have limited use of them for the rest of his life. Multiple surgeries hadn't been able to restore full function. He'd need assistance with basic tasks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a man who'd used his hands to assault unconscious girls would spend the rest of his life unable to use those hands properly. He was transferred from the hospital to jail as soon as doctors cleared him to leave. His arraignment was brief. He pleaded not guilty through his public defender because no attorney wanted to take the case privately. His father, Judge Theodore Mercer, sat in the gallery, watching his son in an orange jumpsuit, and wept openly. Whatever influence the Mercer family had once wielded in this town was gone. I never heard from Uncle Frank directly about what happened that night. We saw each other at family gatherings and acted normal. But one evening, about 2 months after the attack, we were both outside at my mom's house during a barbecue and found ourselves alone by the grill. Uncle Frank was drinking beer and staring at nothing when he said quietly that some problems couldn't be solved with paperwork and patience. He said sometimes men who'd seen real violence overseas came home and found the worst monsters weren't in foreign deserts, but in their own communities. He said using those skills to protect family wasn't something he'd lose sleep over. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and I didn't respond. After a moment, he went back to flipping burgers, like the conversation had never happened. The trial started 8 months later and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Video after video showing clear assault on unconscious victims. Kayla had to testify, and I sat with my mom in the gallery holding her hand while our daughter described what had been done to her. Multiple other victims testified. The defense tried to argue that some encounters had been consensual and others couldn't be proven to be Coach Mercer's doing, that he might have been collecting the videos from someone else. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Coach Mercer showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Maria Castellanos, the new judge assigned to the case, handed down 240 years in prison. She said Coach Mercer had preyed on children, had betrayed his position of authority, and had shown no remorse for the suffering he'd caused. She said she hoped the sentence would bring some measure of peace to his victims. The 3 other men from the hotel took plea deals when they saw Coach Mercer's sentence. They testified against each other in exchange for reduced time. The one who worked for the city got 20 years. The other 2 got 15 and 18 respectively. Their trials were quieter, less media attention, but the convictions still mattered. 4 predators were removed from society permanently. The encrypted chat logs led investigators to 3 more men in neighboring counties who'd been part of the network. Those investigations were ongoing. What had started as one girl's assault had exposed a ring of predators who'd been operating with impunity for years. The scope of the damage they'd caused would probably never be fully known, but at least it was stopped now. Kayla graduated from high school 2 years after the hotel. She'd transferred schools, finished her credits online, and walked across the stage to receive her diploma with our family cheering in the crowd. She'd gotten into college with a full scholarship for students who'd overcome adversity. She wanted to study criminal justice and work with assault survivors. The therapist said this kind of purpose-driven goal was common among trauma survivors and could be part of healthy healing if Kayla maintained proper boundaries and self-care. Kayla said she wanted to be the person she'd needed when everything fell apart. She wanted to help other girls navigate the system and fight back against men who thought they were untouchable. Watching her walk across that graduation stage, stronger than she'd been before the horror, made me believe that survival was possible even after unthinkable violation. My mom asked me once, about a year after everything settled, if I'd had anything to do with what happened to Coach Mercer. We were alone in the kitchen late at night, and she asked the question quietly, like she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She studied my face for a long moment and then nodded slowly. She said she'd spent a lot of time thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between them. She said she'd concluded that sometimes the universe corrected its own mistakes, and it wasn't her place to question how that correction happened. She said she was grateful Coach Mercer couldn't hurt anyone else, and that was all that mattered. She hugged me tight and told me she loved me. We never spoke about it again. Detective Kowalski closed the case on Coach Mercer's assault without identifying any suspects. The investigation found no physical evidence linking anyone to the crime. My alibi at the warehouse held up under scrutiny. Uncle Frank had been at a bar with 6 witnesses who all remembered him being there that whole night. Whoever had actually carried out the attack was a ghost. Detective Kowalski made one more visit to our house about 6 months after the trial. She said she was following up on loose ends and wanted to make sure our family was doing okay. She mentioned that she'd seen similar cases where the law failed victims, and then vigilante justice seemed to appear from nowhere. She said she understood why that happened, even if she couldn't officially condone it. She said as long as the right people ended up in prison and the victims got justice, she could live with ambiguity about how certain events unfolded. I went back to school myself and finished my degree in business management. Got a job with a logistics company doing supply chain work. Normal, boring adult life that let me support my mom and help with Kayla's college expenses. I dated occasionally, but nothing serious because I couldn't figure out how to explain to potential partners why I sometimes woke up at night thinking about violence. The therapist my mom had found for Kayla suggested I might benefit from counseling too. She said family members of assault victims often carried their own trauma and guilt about not preventing what happened. I went to a few sessions but stopped because talking about feelings never made them go away. I just learned to live with the weight of what I'd done and decided I could carry it if it meant my sister was safe. Uncle Frank died 3 years after the trial. Heart attack at 51, sudden and unexpected. At his funeral, several rough-looking men I didn't recognize showed up to pay respects. They stood in the back during the service and left immediately after without introducing themselves. One of them, a tall man with a scarred face and gray hair, caught my eye as he was leaving. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and walked away. I never learned his name or whether he'd been the one to actually hurt Coach Mercer. I decided I preferred not knowing the specific details. Uncle Frank's death hit me harder than I expected. He'd been the one person who'd understood what needed to be done and had the connections to make it happen. The world felt less safe without him in it. Kayla called me during her second year of college with news. She'd been accepted into a program that trained advocates for assault survivors navigating the legal system. She'd be working directly with prosecutors and victim services coordinators. She said she wanted to be the person who made sure no one else fell through the cracks the way she almost had. She said she wanted to fight for the girls who couldn't fight for themselves. The pride I felt hearing her voice, strong and determined, almost broke me. She'd taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into purpose. Not everyone could do that. She was braver than I'd ever be. Years passed and the case faded from regular news coverage. Coach Mercer remained in prison, his appeals denied at every level. Judge Theodore Mercer moved to another state, unable to handle the shame of his son's crimes. Police Chief Ronald Mercer's pension was investigated but ultimately upheld despite evidence suggesting he'd interfered with previous investigations. The system protecting its own, even in disgrace. The school district paid out millions in settlements to victims. New policies were implemented regarding authority figures and student interactions. Mandatory background checks were strengthened. The changes came too late for the girls who'd already been hurt, but maybe they'd prevent future predation. Small progress built on the ruins of destroyed innocence. I think about that night sometimes, the night I called Uncle Frank and set everything in motion. I wonder if there was another way, a path through legal channels that would have worked if I'd just been more patient or found the right lawyer or made enough noise. But then, I remember Detective Kowalski's face when she'd explained why the DA wouldn't prosecute. Remember the smug smile on Coach Mercer's face in that grocery store? Remember Kayla's vacant eyes staring at nothing while she hid in her room? The system had failed. Not through malice necessarily, but through the 1,000 small compromises that let powerful people protect their own. Someone had to break that protection, and sometimes breaking things required force the law wouldn't sanction. I don't consider myself a vigilante or a hero. I'm just a brother who couldn't watch his sister suffer while her assailant walked free. I used resources available to me to solve a problem the legitimate authorities wouldn't address. Whether that makes me morally compromised is a question I've stopped trying to answer. The consequences of inaction would have been worse than the consequences of what I did. Coach Mercer would still be coaching at that high school, still drugging girls at hotels, still collecting trophies from his crimes. More victims would have existed by now, suffering alone like Kayla almost had. The math was simple, even if the ethics were complicated. I chose my sister over abstract principles of justice, and I'd make the same choice again. Kayla's working now as a victim advocate in the prosecutor's office 2 counties over. She helps prepare assault survivors for trial, explains the legal process, connects them with resources. She's good at her work because she understands what they're going through in ways no textbook can teach. She calls me once a week, and we talk about normal things. Her job, my job, mom's health, whether the local sports teams are worth watching. We don't talk about the hotel or the trial or what happened to Coach Mercer in that alley. Some conversations don't need to happen because everyone already knows what everyone else is thinking. The silence around certain topics is its own form of acknowledgement. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up news articles about Coach Mercer's trial and read the victim impact statements. 23 girls and women describing how he'd stolen pieces of their lives they'd never get back, how they'd spent years blaming themselves, questioning whether they'd done something to deserve what happened, how seeing him convicted had allowed them to finally begin healing. The statements are brutal to read, but I force myself through them because forgetting would be worse. These are the lives that mattered when I made my choice. These are the people the system abandoned until violence forced it to pay attention. I don't know if that makes what happened right, but it makes it necessary. The last time I saw Kayla was at Mom's birthday dinner last month. She looked healthy and happy, laughing with her boyfriend about something stupid he'd said. Watching her exist in normal joy without shadows pulling at her made every difficult decision worth it. She caught me staring and smiled, raising her glass in a silent toast. I raised mine back, and we drank without words because some understanding runs too deep for speech. My sister survived and found purpose in her survival. The man who tried to destroy her is locked away forever. The world kept turning, and somehow we all learned to live in it again.